Hi there, my name is Richard and I operate a Toronto history company called Muddy York Walking Tours. The following is a presentation that I delivered to the East York Historical Society on the evening of May the 31st, 2022. It was the first time that I was able to speak in person in a public library in over 2 years. My 45-minute talk looks back at some of the adversity that Toronto has survived throughout its history and attempts to draw inspiration for those of us trying to deal with all the problems of the modern world. Overall, I hope to draw on some of the great things that Toronto has accomplished while it coped with some of the most difficult periods in its history. Like any city, Toronto has known its share of adversity, but I've chosen to mostly focus on the years between 1910 and 1930. This wasn't just an arbitrary choice. I've chosen this time because there was just so much going on in the city at the time. These were years during which the city of Toronto invested in itself, and it did all of this at the same time that it struggled with a global war and a devastating pandemic. This concept of staying the course, or even of improving ourselves while we grapple with adversity, is an idea that I've tried to weave throughout my presentation. I know that we've all probably become pretty weary over the past couple of years. The current pandemic has worn us down, and there are other news stories that could easily make our lives seem uncertain too. But as we meet here in a public library in person for the first time in over 2 years, I hope that we can draw some comfort, hope, and inspiration from the way that Toronto and its people have overcome adversity in the past and gone on to build a better city. This is a postcard from 1900. It shows the view up Yonge Street from King Street. The sheer number of people crowding into the city streets had doubled in just 2 decades. There were 181,000 people in 1891, 208,000 in 1901, and 377,000 in 1911. So in 1911, there were more than twice as many people in Toronto as there had been just 20 years before. Now, here's a similar image, this time in a photograph. It was also taken in 1900 and shows Yonge Street looking north from Adelaide Street. It's obvious that people were moving to Toronto in the thousands and the tens of thousands. And as we look at images of Toronto's downtown core taken in the first few years of the 1900s, we see glimpses of the booming metropolis that Toronto was quickly becoming. Here's another postcard showing Toronto's skyline about 1910. It shows a busy looking urban center that's built up out to the horizon, far past the city's northern limits. In many ways, it was a city on the verge of improving itself. The next few years would bring some great advances in culture, in business, in transportation, and in social services. But when we leave behind the postcard view and we examine the reality, we discover that there were definitely blemishes on the city's landscape. Let's take a closer look at the area around Toronto City Hall to see one of the worst neighborhoods from Toronto's history. The neighborhood that I'm referring to was officially known as St. John's Ward, but throughout its history, it was commonly just called the Ward. It was bounded by Queen Street to the south, College Street to the north, Yonge Street to the east, and University Avenue to the west. But the ward was really centered on the northwest corner of Queen and Bay Streets, which put it right next to Toronto's 1899 City Hall. This photograph of the old neighborhood from just over 100 years ago speaks volumes. It's looking south from about where Nathan Phillips Square is today. City Hall is on the left, and all that ramshackle housing you can see lay right at the heart of the ward. A few moments ago, I mentioned the population boom that was hitting Toronto in the early 1900s. This photograph from 1910 shows a family of immigrants arriving at Union Station. This influx of newcomers, many of whom were poor, created a demand for housing, but the only problem was there wasn't enough room to house everybody. So these newcomers built themselves makeshift homes and lived in appalling squalor. Some improvised cottages had started going up in the ward as far back as the 1830s, when Black Americans came to Canadian cities like Toronto to escape slavery. But by the end of the 1800s, the ward was home to all sorts of refugees. They were Irish, who fled the Great Famine in that country, Italian families like this one, whose fathers and husbands and sons worked as migrant workers, and then thousands of Jewish newcomers who were escaping from persecution in Eastern Europe. By the 1910s, the ward had become home to Toronto's growing Chinese community. They faced racism but Toronto's Chinese run chop suey restaurants and laundromats also got some financial support from Toronto's largely ethnic British or English speaking population, at least in the terms of paying customers. There was great racism by the Canadian government on bans on immigration for Chinese newcomers, but there was also a broad economic demand for the various businesses that the Chinese operated out of the ward. Well, St. John's Ward wasn't the only Toronto neighborhood that saw large-scale immigration settlement in the early 1900s. It was one of the most overcrowded. Since it was centered around City Hall, it was also one of the most visible. But at its heart, it was also right next to the T. Eaton Company factory, which was located up James Street, north of Queen Street, right behind City Hall. And you can see the Eaton Company factory in this diagram from 1920. It's the building more or less at the center with a yellow pediment on top. That ill-defined haze in the background over to the west or to the left in the drawing is where the ward was centered. This image of the Eaton's factory from 1920 shows us how it was right next door to the rundown housing of the ward. Many of the ward's residents worked in the offices and sweatshops that the Eaton's department store ran. Others ran their own businesses, which included everything from peddlers' carts to cafes, bottling factories, and junkyards. This photograph from 1911 shows one of Toronto's rag and bone men. These men were largely Jewish immigrants who operated as Toronto's unofficial waste collection squad at a time before there were a lot of municipal services. They gathered up the city's refuse and often recycled the rags and the bones to convert them into new fabrics and buttons. As they led their carts around the city, the rag and bone men of the ward were sometimes derided as garbage pickers, but they provided a valuable service back when most neighborhoods didn't have any weekly curbside pickup. And this process of repurposing what they found led many Jewish immigrants into the garment and clothes making industries. By 1910, the packed rooming houses and the tumble-down shanties in the ward came to be viewed as both a blight on the city and a potential health disaster. Many of the families in the ward shared communal kitchens and toilets, and several of its homes didn't even have drains. Most of the residents of the ward were too poor or too overworked or just too demoralized to put any proper effort into decent hygiene. Diseases often ran rampant because so many people lived in unsanitary conditions in such close proximity to one another. The ward was also viewed despairingly for its moral rot, either real or perceived. Its residents were often viewed as the ignorant poor, who were too lazy to improve themselves. Social reformers targeted the ward as a hotbed of gambling and prostitution, while the temperance movement complained about bootleg liquor that provided much needed income for many poor families. That nickname, the ward, became like a byword, a code name for both the slum-like living conditions and the corrupting influence of foreigners that were threatening the gleaming city that Toronto was trying to make itself into by 1910. Certainly, the poor health and poverty of the ward was one of the major obstacles that Toronto faced in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Some of the reasons that middle or upper class Torontonians insisted that something must be done about the ward were reactionary or downright racist. They felt that the thousands of immigrants who were streaming into the city had to be contained. But there were legitimate concerns too. All those masses of malnourished people living in squalor and surviving together in overcrowded, filthy conditions were a very visible reminder that Toronto had ignored the matter of proper public health for years. This is what it looks like when a city has no healthcare funding. If Toronto was ever going to become the kind of gilded metropolis that it wanted to become, it would finally have to take on not only poverty, but the plumbing. We needed things like clean drinking water, uncontaminated food, and access to good health resources, not only for the poor, but for everybody. Unfortunately, this was when a hero entered the story. This man, Dr. Charles Hastings, was a 52-year-old obstetrician from Markham when he became Toronto's medical health officer in 1910. The shockingly poor state of health in the ward was only one of the problems that he inherited when he took on the job as Toronto's top health guardian. He would spend nearly 20 years cleaning up Toronto before retiring in 1929. In that time, he not only tackled the problems of the ward, but he also instituted several initiatives that made Toronto one of the leading cities in North America for healthcare. Dr. Charles Hastings will definitely re-enter the story again before my presentation is through. Toronto, along with the rest of Canada and many other nations around the world, soon faced a global crisis. This was the First World War. This conflict was later dubbed the Great War because of the enormous impact it had on international politics, on the global economy, on technology and tactics, and the lives and deaths of millions of people. The First World War was great in the sense that it took an almost unfathomable cost in human life. According to the Canadian War Museum, an estimated 619,636 Canadians served with the Canadian Expeditionary Force during the war. Approximately 424,000 of these served overseas. Over 66,000 of these were killed, and another 172,000 were wounded. They fought in battles at places that have entered into Canadian history, like Ypres in April and May of 1915, or the Somme between July and November of 1916, or at Vimy Ridge in April of 1917, or at Passchendaele between October and November of 1917. The number of Canadians killed or injured in these 4 battles alone were numbered in the tens of thousands. This feels like an almost incomprehensible figure for most of us, and yet I know that my recital of these losses may make for some gloomy reflection. But despite the ways in which Canada's wartime sacrifice helped to shape our national identity, I've chosen not to talk about the history of wartime battlefields. Instead, I'd like to shift gears and mostly talk about how the country reacted to this tragedy once the war was over. Because we've all been through a difficult couple of years, and there are still news stories out there that might make us feel anxious. But maybe we can take some hope out of the way that Canadians responded to grief, loss, and tragedy over 100 years ago now, once the First World War ended in 1918. These were some of the men of the 48th Highlanders returning to Toronto after the war. Canadian wartime propaganda had promised veterans a land fit for heroes, 20 of those who served and then came home. But while the government might have had good intentions, it would be misleading to say that this promise was an easy one to fulfill. This photograph shows 6-inch shells being inspected in a munitions factory in Toronto's Leaside neighborhood in 1917. It helps to illustrate how during the war, most of the economy had been redefined almost entirely as industry was geared towards military production. But once the war ended, many of these industries reduced their workforce or went out of business entirely. In addition, the First World War was different than previous conflicts in that there was a much higher rate of soldiers who were injured, but still survived and came back home to Canada. Canada developed a pension and benefits plan for these injured veterans, which was progressive, but also complicated. It was hard to deny that a veteran who was missing an arm, a leg, or an eye qualified for a government pension. But those who had been injured by poison gas or who suffered from chronic illness or mental trauma had difficulty convincing pension adjudicators that their symptoms were war-related or even real. These men often encountered skepticism or even downright rejection. It soon became evident that government pensions and military charities would not be enough to fully provide for veterans. But at least the government tried to give economic relief to the unemployed and the chronically injured. Canada had run a series of victory bond campaigns during the war. Posters like this one urged Canadians to buy these bonds, and these bonds often used patriotic or even very nearly spiritual imagery. Here's another example of a wartime victory bond poster. It uses John McCrae's poem in Flanders Fields in a way that he might never have imagined. The victory bond scheme was highly successful. Proceeds from victory bonds that were sold between 1915 and 1918 were used to pay for building things like tanks or airplanes or for turning out explosive shells. But although the war ended in 1918, there was a victory bond campaign in 1919. That year's campaign focused on raising money to bring our boys back and paying for the rehabilitation and reintegration of soldiers. The two posters that I've shown here encourage Canadians to invest in the 1919 Victory Bond campaign in order to repatriate soldiers and to help reestablish them in civilian society. We can compare those Victory Bond campaigns of 1919 to the economic incentives that helped to support people almost exactly 100 years later at the start of the COVID-19 epidemic. During the current pandemic, there has been financial support for people who have been put out of work. And there have also been calls for paid sick leave and other changes that would make Canada's labor laws more compassionate. And in a way, we can trace many of our modern social benefits back to the aftermath of the First World War. If we can draw one positive element of that horribly bloody conflict, it might be that provisions made for our returning First World War heroes ultimately led to the social welfare that would go on to help so many Canadians in the century since. And for an even greater sense of hope and joy, we can look at some images from the morning that Toronto first learned that the First World War was over. In the early morning hours of Monday, November the 11th, 1918, the word came through over the wires that the war was officially over. An official announcement was made at about 3 o'clock that Monday morning. This photograph shows a Toronto family waking to read the newspaper headlines. Now, I suspect that we won't have the same sort of particular or specific moment when we know for sure that COVID is finally and absolutely over. But on Armistice Day, November the 11th, 1918, special editions of Toronto's daily newspapers were hitting the streets within about 20 minutes of when the peace was announced. The printed headlines faced competition from the church bells, the fire sirens, and the factory whistles as people poured out onto the street. The war was over, and as one newspaper put it, Toronto went mad with glory. The Toronto Telegram newspaper sent a car around the city to document how celebrations were breaking out. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the streets were full of people in their pajamas, dancing, singing, clanging tin cans together, and lighting impromptu bonfires. People had waited 4 years and 3 months for the news that the war was over, and when they learned that it was, the city celebrated in an orgy of joy. As the Mail and Empire newspaper put it, very few people went into work. Despite the fact that courts were in session, Toronto's police magistrate, Rupert Kingsford, gave clemency to anyone up on charges of minor offenses like drunkenness or gambling. This is not a day for punishment, he said. It's a day for amnesty and pardon. It was as if a great carnival of victory had taken over the streets. People draped themselves in red ensigns, Union Jacks, and other Allied flags as tens of thousands of people crowded onto Yonge Street, King Street, Queen Street, and other major thoroughfares. A military parade had been scheduled to take place on November the 11th, but once news of the war's end gripped the city, this was turned into a victory march. There were dramatic exhibitions of the mighty armaments that Canada had produced during the war, like this demonstration of a tank crushing a car on University Avenue. Toronto Mayor Tommy Church made a speech, several marching bands played a variety of music, and wounded soldiers were chauffeured around the city in cars. But no matter how people celebrated through impromptu marches and music or taking to the streets, gathering in crowds, getting together with their neighbors, or decking themselves out in their finest clothes, there was at last a sense of both release and accomplishment. They'd made it. The war was over. That painting on the left shows the Armistice Day celebrations up Yonge Street. It's by an artist named Joseph Ernest Sampson, and he's made the scene look exuberant. I feel that celebration and commemoration are important. We're all human, and we need to celebrate life. I hope that we can all hang on to hope. Even though some of the hard times that we're all living through right now may not be completely over yet, I look forward to the times to come when we can continue to gather together and emulate all the joy that people in Toronto have expressed on other occasions in our city's history. There was, of course, another burden for Toronto to overcome, just as the Great War was ending. In the last few months of 1918, Toronto was struck by a global epidemic. This was the so-called Spanish flu. The outbreak began during the First World War, and belligerent nations were reluctant to release any news of the disease in their own countries out of fear of weakening morale. Spain was neutral during the war, though, and it published more information about the flu, which created false impressions that Spain was particularly hard hit or that Spain had been the source of the disease. There was no clear indication of exactly where the pandemic got its start. As early as January of 1918, cases had been identified in France, in Austria, in China, and in the Midwestern United States. So as the First World War drew to a close, Toronto was invaded by an enemy just as bad as those found on the battlefields of Europe. The first cases of Spanish flu hit Toronto in the last few days of September of 1918. A single sneeze could release 500,000 infectious particles. It only took a month for half of the city's population to come down with the disease. The first casualty of the Spanish flu in Toronto was thought to be a young schoolgirl who died at the Toronto General Hospital at the end of the first week of October 1918. But by that time, there were hundreds of people in the city's hospitals displaying symptoms of the illness. By October of 1918, hundreds of Spanish flu victims had been admitted to Toronto hospitals, and pretty soon all the hospitals were full. Toronto's landmark King Edward Hotel, which I've shown here, was just one of the city's several hotels that began doubling as emergency hospital wards. Schools in Toronto and all across Canada struggled with the flu epidemic too. This photograph shows a teacher at Victoria Park Forest School showing her students how to properly blow their noses. But by October the 8th, 1918, nearly 260 teachers and 10,000 students were absent from school, either because they were sick already or because they were dreadfully afraid of getting sick. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 swept through the city so quickly, there was almost no time for any official reaction. There were some attempts at a citywide quarantine, and the epidemic struck such a fear across the city that people were quite willing to stay at home and try to avoid one another. By October 19th, 1918, the city had ordered that theaters and other public areas should be shut down. Now, of course, this sounds very familiar to all of us. Lockdowns, shuttered businesses, closed schools, and people staying at home, except back in 1918, it all happened before people had the internet or all the other tools that we have today to stay in touch with one another. But then, incredibly, the Spanish flu pandemic lifted just as quickly as it had appeared. The last deaths in Toronto were reported in early November of 1918. Scientists believe that it had mutated to a non-lethal strain, which is apparently a relatively common occurrence with influenza viruses. Earlier in my presentation, I mentioned this man, Dr. Charles Hastings, and now I'd like to start bringing him back into the story. His 19-year career as Toronto's medical health officer included the period when the Spanish flu hit our city. He had the following to say about that earlier pandemic. The epidemic struck Toronto almost like a cyclone, assuming epidemic proportions on or about October the 9th. And continued until November the 2nd, when it subsided almost rapidly as it began. Let's just hope that one day soon, the same thing will happen with COVID. This map shows the number of Spanish flu casualties around the world as a percentage of each country's population. The countries with the greatest number of influenza deaths are shown in the darkest shades of blue. The pandemic of just over 100 years ago left a death toll of 1,750 people in Toronto, about 50,000 in Canada, and anywhere between 50 and 100 million all around the world. It struck remote islands in the Pacific and research stations in the Arctic and killed off anywhere between 3 and 5% of the world's population. And just like today, there were concentrated efforts to come up with a vaccine. This is an image of the University of Toronto's medical building about 1910. The university had closed its doors to most activities by the middle of October of 1918, but some work continued, including down at the university's anti-toxin laboratory. All through the First World War, the lab had produced vaccines for diseases like tetanus and smallpox. So they were already operating with a number of new vaccines This is a picture of the university's vaccine lab. Staff worked day and night and eventually produced a Spanish flu vaccine by the end of 1918, just as the outbreak was waning here in Toronto. However, they produced the vaccine in large quantities and offered it to anyone else in Canada free of charge. The University of Toronto sent shipments of the vaccine to the United States and to Great Britain. They did advertise that the vaccine was only experimental, and some people refused to take it, but it was a start. It was one of the first really concentrated efforts anywhere in Canada to produce a flu vaccine. Just like today, the vaccine that the University of Toronto produced was a sign that the end of the Spanish flu was finally coming into sight. Now, I'd like to carry on with that theme of hope in healthcare by telling you a little bit more about Dr. Charles Hastings. Earlier, I made reference to how he led the way in cleaning up Toronto's healthcare system. The inspiration for his crusade was personal and tragic. His infant daughter had been killed by contaminated milk that had been sold by a dairy farmer with typhoid fever. So when Dr. Charles Hastings started his public health crusade in 1910, he tackled the two biggest sources of disease: contaminated milk and contaminated water. These photos show some of the regular inspections of Toronto's dairies, which was one of the first procedures that Hastings implemented. Dr. Hastings insisted on having veterinarians inspect the livestock at each and every dairy farm. As Hastings knew all too well from his own personal tragedy, infants and children were especially vulnerable to the dangers of infected milk. This could cause diarrhea, typhoid, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and any number of other infections. Hastings insisted that all dairies heat their milk to 145 degrees for at least 30 minutes to kill any bacteria. If any dairy didn't meet Hastings standards, their milk was seized and poured down the gutter. In 1911, Toronto became the first Canadian city to enforce pasteurization, thanks to Dr. Charles Hastings. Hastings demanded that new chlorination plants be built so that Toronto could become the first city in North America to chlorinate its water. He led the way in modernizing indoor plumbing and the sewer system. The food supply was further sanitized by the mandatory inspection of all slaughterhouses and the medical examination of anyone who handled food at a grocery store or a restaurant. By the time that Hastings retired in 1929, he had a staff of 500 people and an annual operating budget of $1 million. He justified this by pointing out that in just 5 years between 1910 and 1915, cases of diphtheria, scarlet fever, and typhoid fever had been reduced by more than 80%. Infant mortality rates had been reduced by a third. Dr. Hastings grasped the importance of public education and engagement. Nursing staff were sent into the community to perform medical checkups at schools, to give classes in child welfare and prenatal hygiene and other social services. Hastings instituted a quarantine service that treated people with infectious disease and fumigated their homes. Gone were the old days of the last century when people blamed fevers on fog banks. Hastings also tackled the dreadfully impoverished conditions of St. John's Ward. He exposed the horrid conditions of that notorious district and blamed a lot of the illness in the city on the extreme poverty that was found there. Dr. Hastings went through the ramshackle houses and rundown laneways of the ward one by one. He took Toronto's official photographer, Arthur Goss, with him to capture the impoverished state that thousands of people in Toronto were living in. Hastings and his team took hundreds and hundreds of pictures. The pictures held a lot of shock value when he published them over 100 years ago now, which is exactly what Hastings intended. Hastings counted on these photos being so disturbing that they would jolt city officials and the greater public into finally giving a damn about the poor. More than 100 years later, many of them are still heartbreaking. Hastings saw that children in low-income areas across the city suffered from malnourishment, so he began distributing free pasteurized milk. He passionately implored the city's upper financial classes to assist the less fortunate. Hastings said, It is only when we bring these matters home to ourselves that we can realize what the saving of one human life means, what the saving of one case of sickness in a home means. And we must never forget that the infant and the little boy and the little girl, the humblest home in Toronto, is as precious to their parents as our infants and children are or ever have been to us. Hastings' time in public office was one of the first and greatest periods when disease was seriously diminished in Toronto. He proved why cities need publicly funded healthcare. Obviously, we can't give him credit for all of it. It isn't as though he personally invented germ theory or pasteurization or vaccinations or the concept of isolating the sick and cleaning up the water supply. But he was the first public figure in Toronto who really brought all these things together. And he forced City Hall to not only spend money on public health, but to view this as an investment and not as an expense. Well, at this point, I realize that I've been rambling my way through history somewhat. I've tried to show that there have been some low points in Toronto's past, but there have also been reasons for hope, for celebration, and for joy. And through it all, despite the poverty and the war and the poor health of all the years gone by, Toronto did what it could to improve itself. Now, let's take a look at a few of its historic accomplishments from around this time. Just before the First World War, Toronto began investing in its own culture by building a couple of notable galleries and museums. The Royal Ontario Museum was established in April of 1912. The first wing of the museum opened 2 years later on March the 19th, 1914. This first wing faced westwards towards Philosopher's Walk and the University of Toronto. Similarly, the Art Museum of Toronto opened in 1911. The building and its collections have both expanded significantly over the years. It became the Art Gallery of Toronto in 1919 and the Art Gallery of Ontario in 1966. Now, I've already mentioned the Toronto General Hospital. Toronto's first general hospital was actually opened all the way back in 1829, but in 1913, a brand new hospital facility was opened on College Street, just east of University Avenue. The new Toronto General Hospital quickly moved to the forefront of Canadian medicine, and through its partnership with the University of Toronto, it grew into an outstanding center for teaching and research. Now, since then, the hospital has achieved international recognition in the fields of radiology, heart surgery, the treatments of kidney and vascular diseases, of arthritis and of diabetes, and the implementation of insulin. Another landmark Toronto area hospital was also opened around this time. The Toronto East General Hospital opened in 1929. It opened with 110 beds, but a new wing was being added to the hospital about every 10 years or so. Now known as Michael Garron Hospital, it also has a community teaching hospital affiliated with the University of Toronto. Meanwhile, Toronto was making strides in connecting the dozens of neighborhoods that make up our modern day megacity. Transit was just as much a concern 100 years ago as it is today. In 1911, Toronto created its own streetcar service called the Toronto Civic Railways. More and more streetcars were delivered to Toronto, and several new routes were added to areas outside Toronto's downtown core. And this picture shows new streetcar track being put down somewhere along Gerrard Street in 1911. Then in 1922, the city created the Toronto Transit Commission, or TTC, out of the old Toronto Civic Railways operation. New bus routes and other services were added to the already expanded streetcar lines. This really was a time when Toronto took control of its transit woes and made a unified decision to effect change. The old, obsolete transit structure was tossed out, and a new era of transit began. This would eventually lead to Toronto's subway system, which with the first line opening between Union Station and Eglinton Avenue in 1954. Now, in many ways, if there is anything worth boasting about Toronto's 21st century transit system, we can trace this back to those formative years between 1911 and 1922. And the city quite literally built bridges to connect neighborhoods and communities throughout Toronto. Construction of the Prince Edward Viaduct started in 1913. The massive bridge spans Bloor Street, soaring a total of 40 meters or 131 feet over the floor of the Don Valley. This picture shows the bridge under construction in 1916. It was quite significant that work continued during the First World War when so many other big municipal projects ground to a halt. But before the bridge was officially opened in 1918, Toronto really was like two separate cities broken up by the natural barrier of the Don River. But now Toronto is more connected, and neighborhoods like East York and North York were better joined together with central Toronto. At this point, I quickly mentioned the other great bridge over the Don River. The Leaside Bridge opened on October the 29th, 1927. The bridge takes Millwood Road over the Don River. Now, for some reason, it's usually overshadowed by the Prince Edward Viaduct across Bloor Street, and the Leaside Bridge never seems to get the attention that it might deserve. Once the Leaside Bridge and the Prince Edward Viaduct were in operation, those areas east of the Don Valley were finally being integrated into the more central part of the city. This was an important step in connecting what had previously been two profoundly separated parts of Toronto. So by 1929, Toronto was becoming a metropolis full of promise, a city brimming with optimism and hope for the future. We had survived the First World War and a global pandemic. We had tackled poverty and invested in healthcare while embracing culture, opening museums and hospitals, and laying tracks and building bridges to connect communities. It would, of course, be completely untrue to say that there weren't more hard times in store for Toronto. The stock market crash of 1929 brought around the Great Depression. People in Toronto and the world over queued up for social assistance as they struggled with unemployment, homelessness, poverty, and despair. And then when Canada entered the Second World War, there were 6 more years of violence, loss, bloodshed, and trauma, but people endured, and in some cases, they even rallied. This has really been the main point of my presentation that I've tried to make. This is a photograph of a wartime children's rally at Maple Leaf Gardens in 1941. Life will always give us hardship, but I hope that together we can draw on the resilience of people in the past. People got through, and hopefully we can too. This is a picture of the Victory in Europe celebrations that took place in Toronto on May the 8th, 1945. Another war was over, and this was another reason to celebrate. This mirrors the ways in which people celebrated the end of the First World War, and hopefully the days in which we can come together again and celebrate as a community are at hand. But I also hope that we'll never forget the need to take care of the sick, the downtrodden, and the vulnerable. I've always been inspired that the work that a few of our city forefathers, like Dr. Charles Hastings, did 100 years ago. This work is often overlooked, although it helped to save our city. Let's continue to be inspired by the advancements that Toronto has made in the past, and let's continue to help anyone who needs us in the future. Now, I'd like to end my presentation with one final thought, and that's that this too shall pass. There is an old legend about how this expression came to be. The fable tells of a powerful king or sultan who commanded his wise men to think up an expression that would be true and appropriate in every situation. What one saying could be universally true in both good times and bad. These wise men came up with the expression, this too shall pass. And indeed, this is a good phrase to remember during both the good times and the bad. It reminds us of how we have to always take the good and the bad together. Our lives are barely ever completely perfect, are they? When we're going through good times, it's important to stay humble and generous. Enjoy what we have when we have it, because hard times and adversity are probably just around the corner. But when we're going through bad times, it's important to remember that they're mostly only temporary. Search for whatever joy any day can bring us. I think that when we share adversity or a crisis together, it can be a good opportunity to practice compassion and kindness. Check in on your neighbors and try to help one another. Sometimes it feels like this is the only way to keep on getting through. Well, that's my unsolicited opinion anyway. I hope that my presentation has highlighted some of the good times in Toronto's history and emphasized how people have struggled through the hard times to make our city a better place. In the past, Toronto has seized on opportunities to improve itself, and hopefully those of us living now can do the same. When I put my original presentation together, the chairman of the East York Historical Society gave me one other obligation to fulfill for their first in-person evening since COVID began. And she asked me to include some uplifting music. So I started with some silent film footage of Toronto from 1928 and 1929 and set it to a couple of the top songs of the time. Now I've actually uploaded this to YouTube in a separate post, and you can find the link to that post in my description below in the comments. For now, though, this concludes my presentation. I hope that you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you stay optimistic and hopeful. And let's hope that this summer things can at least start to return to normal. If you'd like to find me for more information on other talks and tours, my website is www.muddyyorktours.com, and I have also posted other links and sites in my description below. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you've enjoyed my presentation.